This video will focus on the addictions of Patrick Branwell Brontë, otherwise known as Branwell. For an overview of Branwell's artistic ability, you can check out that video on my channel. Branwell Brontë was the fourth of 6 Brontë siblings, born a year and 2 months after Charlotte Brontë. He and Charlotte were particularly close in childhood, and they created worlds known only to them of Glasstown and Angria. Many of Branwell's writings relate to these works, and he wrote the books in a tiny, almost illegible hand, and these books are on display at the Haworth Parsonage Museum. Here is the Haworth Parsonage Museum as we know it today, otherwise referred to as the Brontë Parsonage, and it is where the Brontës spent the majority of their lives. Branwell was a highly imaginative young boy, and his father, Patrick Brontë, the Anglican reverend, was protective of him, and he was the apple of his father's eye. Unlike his sisters, he was not formally educated in a boarding school or otherwise. He was educated at home, and it is believed this was done because his father did not have the highest opinion of boarding schools, having attended them himself. Branwell was a skilled organ player and would accompany his father's sermons with his organ playing. However, he was not very well socialized. He spent a lot of his creative ability on the made-up colonial towns of Glasstown and Angria, and he funneled his aspirations into his hero, known as Alexander Percy. Daphne du Maurier undertook a biography of Branwell in 1960, and I will be relying on that biography to explain his addiction. I will also be reading recollections of Branwell so we can see how he was remembered during his lifetime and after his death. According to the Chambers Journal in 1868, Mr. Branwell was the cleverest of the family according to his father. A wonderful talker he was, and able to do things which nobody he had ever seen could do. He had seen Branwell sitting in the vestry talking to his father and writing 2 different letters at the same time. He could take a pen in each hand and write a letter with each one. He had seen him do that many times and had afterwards read the letters written in that way. Yes, it was true that he had come to a sad end. One of the Brontë biographers, Mrs. Gaskell, who was a friend of Charlotte Brontë, did not impress the Haworth people because Mrs. Gaskell alleged that the villagers of Haworth encouraged Branwell to drink. When Branwell was 19 years old, he was secretary to the Temperance Society in the village, and this was a temperance society that his father helped run. And it was not until after Branwell was 19 that he learned to drink. It's not correct that the landlord of the Black Bull had anything to do with teaching him, although it was true that he used to sit in the back parlor there and drink almost constantly of an evening. So much so that there is a chair that Branwell Brontë used to sit in, known as Branwell's chair, and that's now in the Parsonage Museum. If he could have got a drink there, he would have been sure to get it there, and if he couldn't, he would have gotten it somewhere else. But he was a fine talker and such a talker, and when he was at his worst, he never missed coming to the Sunday school with his sisters, known as the old schoolrooms, where they sometimes taught. All of the Brontës used to come there regularly. Unlike his sisters, who were prepared for the careers of governesses, Branwell was not prepared for any specific career at all, and it was remembered in 1908 that it was a pity Branwell was not sent away in early life. Then all might have been different. He was a merry, well-read, interesting boy, and the men who gathered at the Black Bull for liquor and entertainment enjoyed his gay company and made him welcome. Nor was it surprising that Branwell went there, considering that there was not a lad in the village of his own social standing with whom he could have consorted. And this is accurate. Branwell craved social groups, and he craved intellectual conversations. And as early as age 11, he began producing a magazine called Branwell's Blackwoods Magazine, which included his poems, plays, criticisms, histories, and dialogues. And he did this because he admired Blackwoods Magazine, and he admired the men who wrote for Blackwoods Magazine. He wrote more than 15 letters to Blackwoods Magazine asking to be considered for publication, and none of these letters were answered. He attempted to find work on the death of James Hogg, a Blackwoods writer, starting in the early 1830s, and so this was the career he wanted to embark upon. It's not that he was ignored by his father. Branwell's father did engage an artist, John Bradley, in 1829 and 1830 as a drawing master for the children, and Branwell took the artistry to heart, and we can see many of his sketches today, and there are also paintings of Branwell's, including an 1834 painting of his sisters and himself, but he became dissatisfied with his own image and painted it out, and this portrait now hangs in the National Portrait Gallery. In 1835, he was under the tutelage of portrait painter William Robinson, who had a higher social standing than John Bradley. Robinson had painted the Duke of Wellington and had contacts at the Royal Academy of Art in London, and Branwell wrote a letter to the Royal Academy of Arts in 1835 seeking to be admitted, and his father was very proud of this. It's not known if Branwell was admitted into the Royal Academy of Arts. He would have had to submit 10 works for consideration, and there's no record of these works at the Royal Academy. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. There is a recollection Branwell had that he was on a train during this time frame, and he decided that putting in all this effort to become a painter or to become anything just wasn't worth it. And so biographers think if he did go to London, he got drunk and started drinking then and was full of self-doubt and never went to the Royal Academy, and some biographers think he never went to London at all. According to Francis Leyland, who was Bronte's friend and a future biographer of the family, Branwell's first job was as an usher at a Halifax school. Branwell's sister Anne was working in Halifax, and so he was able to have contacts there. But Branwell did use his learning, and whether financially backed by his aunt, who he loved, or his father, or someone else, he was able to work as a portrait painter in Bradford in 1838 and 1839, and he painted sitters that were found for him by a reverend friend, and it was a career that we can see his output, but unfortunately he did not flourish at it, and one wonders why. It's believed that he just wasn't ambitious. He did not varnish his own paintings. He took a long time to finish them. The body of work he completed is not great unless there was some dissolution of the oils, and we haven't found the bulk of the works, but Branwell was not an entire success in the town of Bradford as a portrait painter. Branwell's interest in having male friends was heightened in Bradford. And it's in Bradford that he started coming into contact with other artists, including the sculptor Joseph Bentley Leyland, who was 6 years older than Branwell and a much more established sculptor. He was the son of a bookseller, and he was often in debt, but he had commissions from bigwigs in the Halifax area. He had exhibited his work at the Manchester exhibition in 1832, and so Branwell became this sort of worshipper of Leyland. And this was a problem because Leyland was an alcoholic himself and often in debt, and while Leyland was able to have his own flat and get commissions for works such as the memorial to Stephen Beckwith in York Minster and a work of African bloodhounds, Leyland had his issues. He claimed that one of his dogs died in the middle of his sculpture of the African bloodhounds, and I don't know if his works were just not well made, but many of them were destroyed after his death. For example, the African Bloodhounds work was presented to Salford Museum after Leyland's death in 1851 and subsequently destroyed. He had his works fall apart on train rides, so I'm not sure what was going on with Leyland's work, but he did introduce Brontë to a group of artists including William Dearden, George Hogarth, John Nicholson, and John Wilson Anderson. He also introduced him to his younger brother, Francis Leyland, who admired Branwell, but was in a circle of alcoholism, and there was so much ill feeling around Francis Leyland that when Francis Leyland penned his biography of Branwell, many residents of Haworth would not speak to him because he was seen as such a negative influence on Branwell. And so his biography of Branwell, which was published in the 1880s, is subjective. In 1839, Branwell was hanging out with the Leylands, and they went sightseeing to St. Jude's Church, where an evangelical was preaching, and watching the famous preacher shake his fist at Catholicism and the wicked wiles of Rome was familiar to Branwell. Branwell, despite having Irish blood, was not a Catholic. He was Anglican. However, this created issues within Branwell's psyche because he found himself getting along very well with the Irish immigrants coming into Yorkshire, and he would visit their neighborhoods very frequently, and he saw parts of himself in these Irish immigrants. And his father, having immigrated from Ireland, Branwell started to think, what might have been and who is he as it relates to England and the larger population of Haworth. According to Francis Leyland, an attack of tic compelled Branwell to resort to opium, whose soothing effect in pain he had previously known. It's no surprise that Branwell would have known about the soothing effect of opium because it was a remedy that soothed frayed nerves and was a common remedy for diarrhea and coughs. And more significantly, it was said to ward off consumption. This is incredibly important because both of Branwell's older sisters, Maurier and Elizabeth, had died of what was thought to be consumption. There's some dispute over this. Elizabeth may have fallen and had a huge gash on her head at the time she died, according to Daphne du Maurier, so it's not clear if it was just consumption that caused her death, but consumption was a very real fear for the Brontes and for Branwell Brontë. Branwell Brontë had a nervous constitution, and this was commented on by his father. The biographer Leyland said Branwell had tics. This is not an uncommon description. Branwell himself would cry out, my nerves, and it was thought he was too sensitive to be introduced to society as a whole and boarding school with other boys who would have jostled him and gotten into physical fights. This probably hurt Branwell long term, and it's not clear if Branwell was an epileptic, which is a theory that Daphne du Maurier put forth, but he did have some nervous issues, and later in life it was written that he had delirium tremens. So this taking of opium in 1839, when he was 22, is not a surprise. Du Maurier theorizes that Branwell was subject to convulsive attacks, and he was especially nervous this might happen to him while he was out with his friends in 1839, and so he might have gone to the nearest apothecary and obtained opium for just a few pence. Branwell was aware that authors like Samuel Taylor Coleridge and De Quincey would take 53 ounces of laudanum, which is opium dissolved in alcohol, on one day. So Branwell taking a few drops of laudanum was no big deal. And it was not something that would be noticed at home by his temperate father. It was different from drinking, and drinking was seen as an absolute sin, horrible, a social evil, and opium was considered slightly better. So all of these thoughts would have been swirling around Branwell's head. In addition, there was a book at the time, The Pharmacological Basis of Therapeutics, which was sort of a sister book to Reverend Bronte's volume of Domestic Medicine. And this book reported that the vast majority of addicts are persons classified as neurotic or constitutional psychopathic inferiors, and addiction is only one manifestation of their fundamental personality defect. The drug provides an escape mechanism from reality, a way of release from the failures and disappointments of everyday life, a means of bridging the gap between ambition and accomplishment. In this summary, we see Branwell. Branwell had not been able to get into the Royal Academy of Art. His studio was not a success. His poetry was refused by Blackwood's. His letters to Blackwood's writers remained unanswered, and he was very much caught up in his imaginary world of Glasstown and Angria. Branwell Brontë was a member of the Three Graces Masonic Lodge in Haworth since he was 19 years old. And this was an incredible place for him to socialize and meet other young men. He was still craving intellectual company, but the Masonic audience would be with him for his entire life. He painted one of his Masonic friends, John Brown, and actually kept this painting with him his entire life. In 1840, Branwell had to work, and so he was employed as a tutor, and this was a job that he probably saw coming. He was employed with the family of Robert Postlethwaite in Broughton in Furness, but he kept on writing letters to his pub friends and his Masonic lodge friends. And in one letter from March 13th, 1840, he's using pseudonyms for his friends. And these pseudonyms were the Devil's Thumb, the Devil in Mourning, Longshanks, and the Bow-Legged Devil. This is interesting because we see Branwell caught up with a more satanic style, and we also see this reflected in his writings about his hero, Alexander Percy of Angria. So in these letters, which are highly amusing and emotional, and we see the Branwell personality of highs and lows, which his sister Charlotte Brontë would comment on in her letters. But it's interesting that Branwell Brontë was dipping into more satanic imagery in 1840. 1840 was also the year where Branwell would start corresponding and gain a friendship with Hartley Coleridge, who was the son of Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Samuel Taylor Coleridge wrote poems while in an opium haze, and so this was an exciting connection for Branwell, but we see the drug undertones. Hartley Coleridge was in his 40s at the time of his friendship with Branwell, and he was oddly early aged. His contemporaries remember that his hair went white at a very young age, and he was also a very small man. He was, great things were expected of him, but he had a mental breakdown in his youth and never really recovered. Regardless, he was interested in Branwell's ability to translate Horace's odes. Branwell was skilled in Greek and Latin, and he could also do accents incredibly well. And so this was something that Coleridge was interested in. Coleridge's sister, Sarah Coleridge, was also a translator, and so in 1840 he invited Branwell to his cottage, Nab Cottage, in the Lake District. Unfortunately, the translations did not end up being published, and the friendship dropped off. I don't know if it's because Hartley was so sensitive and was shocked by the behavior of Branwell, who at this time had no problem drinking for days, and it's actually cited as one of the reasons he was fired as a tutor in 1840, because his two young pupils, who were both young boys, should not be exposed to such alcoholism. Either way, Hartley's letters to Branwell remained unfinished, and so this was another blow to Branwell. The Brontë family was somewhat familiar with alcohol and alcoholism. In 1822, there's a note in Patrick Brontë's Modern Domestic Medicine book of a remedy for intoxication. The remedy is as follows: 12 drops of pure water of ammonia taken in a wine glass of milk and water, repeated in 10 minutes and again in half an hour. Cold water may answer best. The text continues, Dr. Plett relates the case of a young man of nervous and irritable constitution who, on the 22nd of January 1822, became so violently drunk that he did the most indecent things and broke everything he could get at. When Dr. Plett saw him, he was armed with a knife and running at his parents, with his eyes glaring and his mouth foaming. 12 drops of the water of ammonia were given him in a glass of sugar and water, and he was calmed immediately, ashamed and confused at his conduct. In 1822, Branwell would have been 5 years old, so this note is not about him. In 1837, there's another note saying, only some little effect, only a small quantity, well diluted. Again, it's not clear if this is a note about Branwell, or maybe it's a parishioner, or maybe it's just a general note made by Reverend Patrick Brontë. Then there is the notes that someone was not sleeping well in 1838 in the parsonage. And there's a note that someone is experiencing nightmares, moaning in their sleep, and should be awakened. Was this Branwell in 1838? It's not known. But by 1840, Branwell was drinking, carousing, and engaging in opium use. A note in the Pall Mall Gazette in 1884 by Nancy DeGars was about Branwell, and she said, Branwell was a good lad enough until the serpent beguiled him. He has been made out to be a good deal worse than he really was. Nancy said she could manage him better than anyone else, because she was his nurse, when fits of fury were upon him. And Branwell seemed to have a real affection for his old nurse. He often wanted to paint her portrait, but she declined, saying that she did not consider herself good-looking enough. Branwell, unlike his siblings, had a real gift with children and legitimately enjoyed their company. And so we see a reminiscence from Francis Grundy, who was much younger than Branwell. But Brontë took a fancy to him and continued as a confidential friend throughout good and ill. This is what Grundy says. Poor, brilliant, gay, moody, moping, wildly excitable, miserable Brontë. No history records your many struggles after the good, your wit, brilliance, attractiveness, eagerness for excitement, all the qualities which made you good company and dragged you down to an untimely grave. But you have had a most unnecessary scandal heaped upon you by the author of your sister's biography, this was Mrs. Gaskell, by which that scandal does its best to spoil. This generous gentleman in all his ideas, this madman in many of his acts, died at 28 of grief for a woman. But at 22, what a splendid specimen of brain power running wild he was. What glorious talent he had still to waste. That rector of Haworth little knew how to bring up and bring out his clever family, and the boy least of all. He was a hard, matter-of-fact man, so the girls worked their own way to fame and death. The boy to death only. I knew them all. The father, upright, handsome, distantly courteous, white-haired, tall, knowing me as his son's friend, he would treat me in the Grandisonian fashion, coming himself down to the little inn to invite me, just a boy, up to his house, where I would be coldly uncomfortable until I could escape with Branwell to the moors. Branwell was very like his sisters, almost insignificantly small, one of his life's trials. He had a mass of red hair which he wore brushed high off his forehead to help his height, I fancy, a great bumpy intellectual forehead, nearly half the size of the whole facial contour, small ferrety eyes, deep sunk and still further hidden by the never-removed spectacles, prominent nose but weak lower features. He had a downcast look, which never varied, save for a rapid, momentary glance at long intervals. Small and thin of person, he was the reverse of attractive at first sight. This plain specimen of humanity, who died unhonored, might have made the world of literature and art ring with the name of which he was so proud. He would discourse with wondrous knowledge upon subjects, moral, intellectual, philosophical, for hours, and afterwards accompany his audience to the nearest public house, and recruit his exhausted powers by copious libations. He was proud of his name, his strength, and his abilities. In his fits of passion, I have seen him drive his doubled fist through the panel of a door. It seemed to soothe him. It certainly bruised his knuckles. At times we would drive over in a gig to Haworth, 12 miles, and visit his people. He was then at his best, and would be eloquent and amusing, although sometimes he would burst into tears when returning and swear that he meant to amend. I believe, however, that he was half mad and could not control himself. Poor fellow, this short story by a weak hand is all the biography his memory will know. His age was 28. I have always been of opinion that it remained for me to clear his name from the weight of accusation heaped upon it. I knew him, and indeed I believe all the family, better than Mrs. Gaskell. He was a dear old friend who from the rich storehouse of his knowledge taught me much. I make my humble effort to do my duty to his memory. His letters to me revealed more of his soul's struggles than probably was known to any other. Branwell was no domestic demon. He was just a man moving in a mist who lost his way. More sinned against than sinning. At least he proved the reality of his sorrows. Who was the woman that Branwell fell in love with at age 28, according to this remembrance? She was Lydia Robinson, the mistress of Thorpe Green Hall, and Branwell worked in this house after he was fired from London Foot railway station for alleged theft. Branwell probably did not commit the theft of £11. He was keen to explore the moors and often did that during the workday, and it's thought that a porter stole the £11 and Branwell was blamed for it. Regardless, he lost his job and he joined his sister Anne Brontë, who worked at Thorpe Green Hall as a governess from 1840 to 1845. Anne was the Brontë with the longest length of employment among the siblings, and this job was meaningful to her. Branwell was employed here and quickly fell for Lydia Robinson, the lady of the house. This would be disastrous because he was not someone that Lydia was going to leave her husband for. He became infatuated with her and wrote to his friends about this, saying she was charming and sophisticated and 15 years senior to him. He said that my mistress is damnably too fond of me, and sent him a lock of her hair which has lain at night on his breast. Would to God it could do so legally. In July 1845 he was dismissed from his position, and according to the biographer Gaskell, he received a letter sternly dismissing him. When we look through the account books of the Robinson family, there's nothing shocking, nothing to indicate that Branwell was stealing or was going to be punished. We can see that the Robinson family was paying for ferret food for their children, and so nothing is out of order, but it's believed that he was dismissed for his affair with Lydia. It's also possible that he was dismissed for his ongoing alcoholism and laudanum addiction. For several months after his dismissal, he regularly received small amounts of money from Thorpe Green, sent by Mrs. Robinson herself, probably to dissuade Branwell from blackmailing his former employer and lover. Branwell was not great with money. He was remembered by children around Haworth that he would throw pennies for them, and he was generous with his money, so this must have been a nice gesture. Branwell's decline was happening. In the 1840s, he was back home in Haworth and trying to get his works published. He did manage to publish some of his poems in local newspapers, but this did not damper his alcoholism and drug addiction. Mrs. Robinson wrote to him stating that she would not marry him, and so he descended even further. It's important to note that Branwell could get the opium and laudanum very easily. There was a druggist in Haworth by the name of Joseph Hardiker, who was 13 years younger than Branwell, and I believe Hardiker was Haworth's first druggist. I can't confirm this, but I believe that was the case. Hardiker had no problem, and any apothecary would have had no problem giving Branwell the laudanum or the opium, which came in little grains and which Charlotte referred to as lumps. There was no law against it. Also, interestingly, Joseph Hardiker was a poet, and he wrote a poem called The Bridal of Tomar, and it seems like an interesting poem set in England, and so I think that Hardiker might have been one of Branwell's friends, and they might have talked about poetry together, and so Hardiker would have been even more loath to deny Branwell his opium and laudanum. Branwell would also write letters to his friends begging for 5 pence to buy gin, and Branwell's alcohol of choice was gin and also whiskey. There is some discussion about this. The Gaskell biography states that it was Bessie Hardiker, who may have been Joseph's mother, was who dispensed the laudanum, an opium-derived drug, to Branwell Brontë in the years leading up to his death in September 1848. This was a sign that stood on the old apothecary's facade, but the other biographers did some digging, and Betty Hardiker was a wool comber and farmer's wife living outside of Haworth village. And in 1841, 1851, and 1861, census records revealed that the person who ran the apothecary was Robert Lambert, who ran his main street store with the help of his wife Betty. So it seems that over time the names of the two Bettys have become mixed up, and then we see Joseph Hardiker entering the story, and he was this poet, and he would have known Branwell living in Haworth at the time. So there is a lot of confusion around the who was giving Branwell the laudanum. But arsenic was freely available at the time. Cough medicines were given to children and would contain hazardous ingredients like opiates and cocaine. Laudanum was extremely addictive, but available freely without prescription. So regardless of where Branwell got this medicine, he did get it and was addicted to it. In 1842, the Brontë aunt, Elizabeth Branwell, died in Haworth, Yorkshire, and this was a blow to the Brontë family. She had been their mother's sister, and they treated her as a parent, and they loved her. And this death was especially hard for Branwell, who for every death was reminded of the death of his beloved sister Maurier, who taught him to read and write when he was very young. Upon Branwell's realization of this, Charlotte started noticing that her brother had become very thin, and so she attributed this to grief from her aunt's death, but soon realized that Branwell was an opium addict. In a letter to a friend, Branwell wrote, "I have now lost the guide and director of all the happy days connected with my childhood." Opium addiction can cause mood swings and irritability, and Branwell, who was already a moody man, became even worse. Descriptions of himself during this time, he referred to himself as whey-faced and a hermaphrodite. Although he would still go to the pub and socialize, he would also spend a lot of his time in his room. His bed accidentally caught on fire due to an errant candle, and his father had to start sleeping with him, and so Branwell was really on a downward path fast. Charlotte, who had studied in Brussels and had left the family in 1842, was very upset because she was working very hard to provide a living for herself and her siblings, and Branwell was just not pulling his weight and taking up valuable resources at the parsonage. Laudanum was cheaper than alcohol, and according to Thomas de Quincey, who wrote Confessions of an English Opium Eater, it had a tremendous effect on sleep and dreams. It could bring about sleep, and it was something where De Quincey described that he seemed every night to descend, not metaphorically, but literally to descend into chasms and sunless abysses, depths below depths, from which it seemed hopeless that I would ever reascend. Nor did I, by waking, feel that I had reascended. This I do not dwell upon, because the state of gloom which attended these gorgeous spectacles, amounting to, at last, to utter darkness, as of some suicidal despondency, cannot be approached by words. The sense of space and, in the end, the sense of time were both powerfully affected. I sometimes seem to have lived for 70 or 100 years in one night. This procedure and experience would have been very attractive to Branwell, who was always concerned with the internal self and exploring that internal self in his writings about Glasstown and Angria. It's believed that Emily Brontë watched Branwell. She was often at home and frequently would act as nurse to him and her other siblings, and she put his opium delusions in her own work. It might be that Emily also just learned about opium addiction from De Quincey. The Brontë siblings sent him a copy of poems by Kerr, Ellis, and Acton Bell, so they were aware of his reports of opium and laudanum addiction. But I do think it makes sense that Emily talked to Branwell about his addiction and then had conversations about how it impacted him. There is a story that Branwell and Emily were so close that Branwell actually grabbed some of Emily's draft of Wuthering Heights and presented it to his friends as his own. Various theories have come forward for this, that Branwell was the one who wrote Wuthering Heights, which I doubt, or that he was so nearsighted that he accidentally grabbed Emily's papers thinking they were her own, and when he realized this, decided to read the draft aloud to his friends anyway. I tend to think that the latter is more likely. Branwell was fond of pranks and things such as that. Branwell had extreme nearsightedness. He wore glasses for most of his life, and he was also in the habit of storing documents in his hat and taking them out, and this caused some confusion about the words of Wuthering Heights. Regardless, some of his comrades remember hearing the words of Wuthering Heights, and so there was this huge debate after the Brontes' work became super popular that it was Branwell who was the genius behind Wuthering Heights, not Emily. Charlotte was convinced that Branwell never knew of his sister's success. However, letters would come to the Bronte parsonage addressed to the girls, and Branwell probably opened them at some point, thinking they were from him due to the masculine pseudonyms the Bronte sisters would use. And these letters were about the poetry and works that the girls were trying to get published. So I think Branwell had some idea of their efforts. I don't think this would have made Branwell swing into a greater depression. I think he would have been proud of his sisters. On September 24th, 1848, Branwell was in his room and died, most likely due to tuberculosis, aggravated by delirium tremens, alcoholism, and laudanum and opium addiction. His death certificate noted that he died of chronic bronchitis marasmus. I doubt that was the case. All of the sisters were there when he died, and Bronte wanted to show the power of the human will and decided to die standing up, so he did stagger to his feet but died. And then he was interred in the family vault. Emily Bronte took his death especially hard. She was his compatriot, and the two were often alone at the parsonage together, and she died a few months later in December of 1848. Charlotte's letters recall his final days. I wish I could say anything more favorable, but how can we be more comfortable so long as Branwell stays at home and degenerates instead of improving? He will not work, and at home he is a drain on every resource, an impediment to all happiness. She was able to talk to Dr. Wheelhouse of Haworth, but what he recommended was to stop drinking for Branwell. The rapid loss of weight, the continuing cough, the appalling insomnia were left to take their course. If Branwell was ill, he was ill through his own fault. There was no remedy. Charlotte was very bitter about Branwell and his wasted talents. She described him as utterly selfish and self-indulgent. In 1845, she wrote, "For the last 3 years of Branwell's life, he took opium habitually by way of stunning conscience. He drank whenever he could get the opportunity. He took opium because it made him forget for a time more effectively than drink. In procuring it, he showed all the cunning of the opium eater. He would steal out while the family were at church and manage to cajole the village druggist out of a lump. For some time before his death, he had attacks of delirium tremens of the most frightful character." Branwell proceeded to drink himself to death. When he knew the end was come, wanting to die standing, he insisted upon getting up. He had only been in bed a day. Charlotte was so upset that she had to be led away, but her father, Anne, and Emily looked on while he rose to his feet and after a struggle that lasted 20 minutes died, as he wished, standing.